All right, and so we're ready to go. And you will see, on the one hand, a work of art you may be familiar with at this point, Francisco Goya's Murillo de la Verdad, The Truth Has Died, or The Death of Truth, painted in the early 19th century, or around Spanish politics and the death of the Spanish Republic at that point, right? The earlier form of Spanish republicanism before the Spanish Civil War. And the idea that justice can't look as the figures of the church and the state bury truth. But having said that, I'm going to come at the theme that I've associated with this piece of art in a slightly different way today. And so I've given you the provocative title, Why a Post-Trump America Might Still Be a Post-Truth Democracy. And we were actually listening to a little bit of radio coming through somebody's computer as we were getting ready to do this. And we were hearing somebody saying, we've got to hang the memory of Donald Trump around the necks of all Republicans, right? And that seemed to be a postmortem of kinds. You know, Trump is no longer a force to be reckoned with. And I'm not sure that we can write his political obituary quite yet. I think that he has been down several times, but as it turns out, not out. That he has, in addition to remarkable resilience, a remarkable capacity for rebranding himself. He doesn't seem to be very successful in the month after the disastrous electoral results for the Republicans, that I think are very much accounted for by the strong association of so many candidates with Donald Trump, his legacy, and his penchant for untruth, for lies, right? And so, on the one hand, let us hope, let us think that it's at least possible that we're about to exorcise Donald Trump from American politics. And if so, we will have ridded ourselves of a especially charismatic pathological liar. In doing the research for today's lecture, I looked at the number of lies Trump told a day while in office, and it was 5.6, which is about 3 times the next highest ratio that we're aware of. Even Barack Obama told a lie a day while in office. So presidents lie, but Trump definitely set the bar high, both in the types of lies he told, in the boldness with which he lied, and with the frequency with which he lied. And so I think it's fair to call Trump's presidency a post-truth presidency. And one question would be, is it all Donald Trump? Is it just that we put this man in the White House, and therefore the relationship between democracy and truth in the United States from 2016 to 2020 was highly strained, but now we're returning to normal, kind of Joe Biden's promise? And I wish I could feel some confidence about that, but I really don't. And as opposed to that, I'm inclined to think that the roots of the problem we've had with truth, or to put it in a slightly different way, the enabling conditions that allowed Trump to become president, are not directly and personally related to him, but rooted in a variety of social and technological and cultural conditions that are characteristic of the first quarter of the 21st century. And that leads me to focus today, at least, on the idea of a networked public sphere in which digital media technology, social media, are the primary ways in which communication is conveyed, and hence political discourse is structured by these new media. And that the fact that Trump may just no longer be the dominant force in the Republican politics, or the tension vampire of American politics does not mean that those underlying problems have gone away. And hence, I think even in a post-Trump America, we're going to really struggle with the relationship between truth, knowledge, expertise on the one hand, and democracy, disinformation, the willingness to believe in conspiracy theories or to be seduced by populist demagogues. I think that stuff is likely to persist until we address the structural roots of it. So that's the topic for today. I'm going to start by refreshing your memory about some of the disinformation that is circulating broadly in American politics right now. And so just begin by noticing that the Republican candidates for national or statewide office who clearly said the truth, that the 2020 election for president was correctly decided by declaring Joe Biden the victor, that's about 10% of those candidates. And the other 90%, well, the majority of them denied that the election was correctly decided. A smaller share of them cast doubt. I'm not sure. There seem to be some problems. We've got to look into it. And then another substantial portion said, I've got no view. I have no opinion. I'm not going to comment on that. Right. And we then, as a result, have election deniers on the ballots that 60% of Americans see. We have election deniers in almost every state. It looks like Rhode Island is perhaps the lone exception, North Dakota maybe too. And we have at least a year after the election, 70% of Republicans saying that they suspect that there was election fraud. Now, having said all of that, right, and so that speaks to the capacity of disinformation to take over an entire political party, not only its leadership, but much of its rank and file, at least based on what people say when they answer opinion polls. But I do want to refresh your memory, something we looked at when we were doing the postmortem on the 2022 campaign, that people, Republican candidates who were strongly identified with Donald Trump, and one of the main forms in which they identified was by repeating the big lie that the 2020 election had been stolen. They did much less well than Republicans who were not strongly identified with Donald Trump. That's true in competitive districts where being associated with Donald Trump actually swung the electorate a little bit in the direction of the Democrats, and true across the board. And in both of these scenarios, what you see is Republicans who distance themselves from Donald Trump and his disinformation outperforming other Republicans by 5, 6, 7%, right? And so maybe what people were saying to pollsters and what they actually did at the polls was different. And maybe that's some sign, not only in the words of the New York Times, that Donald Trump had a terrible, horrible, awful week, right? His business was found to be guilty of 17 felonies related to tax evasion and compensation schemes. He has this terrible track record with his candidates for both the Senate and governorships. I'd like to say he's doing about as well as the Spanish are doing in penalty kicks at the World Cup. He also is facing multiple fronts of legal jeopardy. We'll get into that. And trying to draw attention by dining and associating himself with more and more extreme hate figures. And so not a good week for Donald Trump, but maybe something deeper is going on here as well. Maybe at least aspects of the fever are breaking. But I want to stick with the medical metaphor here for a second, which is to say, if Donald Trump is not the underlying problem, but merely the symptom, we do well to rid ourselves of that symptom. And he certainly has amplified the problem, and the boldness, the shamelessness with which he lies, and the peculiar hold that he has on a significant segment of the American electorate make him perhaps a uniquely damaging and dangerous politician. And so let us hope that the next iteration of this kind of populist politics is not as bad. It could also be worse. And more importantly, if this is symptomatic, if Trump is symptomatic of problems with our public sphere, then if we are simply happy to wash our hands of Trump and pretend we've closed the door on this episode in our politics, we are not addressing the root cause, and we will most likely be haunted by recurrence or new symptoms. So, again, just to show you a little bit about the way in which the election, in combination with really, I think, the post-election developments, cast some doubt onto the idea that Donald Trump remains the most powerful figure in the Republican Party, remains the best route to Republican electoral success, things that I've certainly said quite recently. The fact of the matter is that election deniers who were incumbents did quite well, but election deniers who were seeking office for the first time did not do nearly as well. And so one question is this about just incumbency advantage? This is true for Congress, where first time office seekers strongly associated with election denial did rather poorly, as well as for state offices, where the only places that strong election deniers prevailed were states that were already dominantly red states. The underlying issue here is not, I think, about the party leadership per se. It's about what average Americans believe, based in large part on what both the party leadership and the media tell them. And this is now more than a year old, and so again, I hope we'll be getting some more data on what people say they believe in 2022 and soon to be 2023 pretty soon. But based on what we knew a year ago, 1 in 4 Americans thought the election was stolen, right? And this is, I think, particularly disturbing. Almost 10% of Americans thought violence would be justified to overturn the election. And then if we drill down on those 1 in 4 who believe the election was stolen, a substantial portion of them believes the QAnon great replacement idea, which is that as African Americans and Hispanics gain full inclusion, including equal rights within the United States, that white people will lose their rights. And the clear, I think, counter example to this would be to ask, well, it's been over 100 years since women gained the right to vote. Have men been displaced and replaced by women in the halls of power, whether that's in Washington, D.C., or corporate America, or elite cultural institutions? And the answer is obviously no. And that gets at a deep fact about the logic of rights, which is that rights are not zero sum. You can afford rights to groups who have been hitherto excluded without diminishing the value of the rights for those who already hold them. This is not competitive, but cooperative or complementary. And arguably, I believe this deeply, the democracy, the polity functions better, is more just, is more inclusive, is more cooperative when everyone is included under the umbrella of equal rights. the other belief that is widespread among those who believe the election was stolen is the core QAnon tenet that a secret group of Satan worshiping pedophiles is ruling the US government. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but now we're getting into the truly preposterous kind of conspiracy thinking that has done so much damage in previous democratic societies. And so while I'm tempted to laugh or smile at the absurdity of that claim, I think I also have to acknowledge that when this kind of claim is not just believed by a few kooks, but becomes substantial enough that it attains a kind of critical mass. And so, 50% of 25%, 10% of Americans believe this, it's no longer something to be laughed or sneered at. It is something to be taken seriously and to lead us into the question, what's going on with our knowledge system? What is going on in our public sphere? What's going on with the media that structure the public sphere and the knowledge system such that a belief that is so manifestly false, so vile, and so dangerous can take hold? And that's where I want to focus today. I'll just point out again, there's a little bit of good news coming out of the elections, and that is that the candidates most strongly associated with the QAnon theory did not do especially well. 2 out of 3 of them were re-elected, but by narrower margins in this, despite the fact that they are in quite strongly Republican districts. And in fact, one of them was defeated in a dramatic swing of opinion. So again, some sense that some of the specific falsehoods that have characterized American politics for the last 6 years are maybe losing some of their potency, some of their hold. Now, to drill down on this, to do my best to provide a framework that allows us to try to think through, why is it that in 2022 and 2016 and the intervening years, so much disinformation is circulating so readily in our politics and the discourse surrounding it? I want to focus attention on a single book. It's not the only thing I'm reading, but it's I think, very useful in organizing ideas. And the book is by a contemporary scholar by the name of Sophia Rosenfeld. She teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an intellectual historian. She's been working for a long time on what's sometimes called the history of the culture or a regime of truth. And so the big book that was published a couple years before her book on democracy and truth, the thing that brought her to my attention initially was a book on common sense. And she starts, as makes sense, with Thomas Paine. And the idea that Paine's title for his pamphlet during the American Revolution was, in fact, revolutionary, incendiary, and in many ways extraordinarily controversial. The claim that ordinary people have sufficient reason, sufficient knowledge, sufficient grasp of morality and political ethics, a strong enough understanding of religion to be able to rely on their common sense, to not need to be instructed by their betters, not sheep looking for a shepherd for protection, but autonomous agents who can rely simply on their own thinking and the deliverance of their sensus communis, their common sense, right? And that she did a whole history of this. And then 2 years later, Donald Trump got elected, and she said, wait a sec, I think that I'm in a good position to maybe also illuminate the complex, the tangled, the tense relationship between democracy and truth in the United States and other European democracies over the last couple hundred years. And so I'm going to impose, and I know there are a lot of words on the screen. I promise I'll unpack them, but impose a bit of a framework on her argument. Her argument is more historical, more narrative, but I think all of these ideas, or at least many of these ideas, emerge out of Sophia Rosenfeld's work. I'll start with a work that she starts with as well. Many people thinking about these topics start with, and that's a famous essay by Hannah Arendt published in the New Yorker in the, I think, late 1960s on truth and politics. And Arendt had just published Eichmann in Jerusalem, and that book had generated a huge amount of controversy. And the claim in particular that the engineer of the final solution, the person who got the trains to get the Jews to the death camps, got the death camps working so as to efficiently murder 6 million people, which is, if nothing else, a difficult engineering task. Arendt went to Jerusalem, watched his trial, listened to his testimony, the interviews, etc., and reported in the New Yorker and then in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem that actually Eichmann was not this terrible evil monster. He was really rather an ordinary and banal man who did what he was told to do without asking any moral questions or exercising any independent moral judgment about it. And by the way, many, many modern individuals, not just Germans, would have done the same thing. We live in a society where we are simply accustomed to doing what the organizations we work in tell us to do. And this was hugely controversial, and Arendt wrote this essay in response to the controversy saying, I'm sorry I've offended you. That's not actually what she says, but that's kind of the implicit subtext. But my job as a philosopher and a historian and a journalist is not to make you happy. My job is to tell the truth, right? And so the idea that if you are, as Arendt puts it, a truth teller, if you're a historian or a philosopher or a mathematician, your responsibility is to go where the evidence and the logic and your reason take you, and to not care about the popularity or the opinion you're going to attract as a result. Whereas if you're a politician, or if you are leading a social movement or trying to mobilize people in politics, you do have to care. You do have to try to figure out ways to make your ideas resonate with public opinion, and that is a fundamentally distinct enterprise. It obeys an entirely different logic. With truth, as John Stuart Mill famously observed a long time ago, one person arrayed against the rest of humanity, or with the rest of humanity arrayed against him, could still be in the right. A minority of one does not mean you're wrong. It just means you're unpopular, right? And so let us recognize that the two realms, truth and politics, are distinct, but also then recognize that that doesn't mean that they don't need to be related to each other. And that if we are in a society where politics completely disregards what science or history or philosophy defends as truth, then we're probably in trouble. And so though distinct, they have to be correctly related to each other. And that's then where Sophia Rosenfeld jumps off. How should modern democracy be related to the truth, and how historically has it been related to the truth? And her central finding is that what we are experiencing in the first quarter of the 21st century is not new or novel. It is something that has happened with some consistency, intermittently or periodically, throughout the history of modern democracy. There have been multiple periods in which the people in democratically organized polities have been more or less willing to go along with what the knowledge elite say, to ground their politics in what reputable journalists report, what intellectual or scholarly or scientific figures suggest are the best policies or the most important factual basis for policy. And then there have been other periods in which the people have rejected the views of elites and journalists and the educated, and been instead more persuaded by populists who suggest that all of that is bunk, right? And so trying to understand, if you will, the pendulum swing between moments when democracy is less and more hostile to the truth, and in particular to recognize that in a modern society, the truth tends to be best understood, even generated and propagated by a technocratic elite, people who are not of ordinary social backgrounds, but who have specialized knowledge and who then claim to instruct ordinary people about what they've learned, that is sometimes well received and sometimes poorly received. And then to on that basis ask, well, can we figure out what are some of the generalizations about the circumstances in which expert knowledge and common sense manage to coalesce or cooperate, and under what circumstances do we tend to get populist pushback? And so that's the guiding idea here. And then I want to try to suggest a few different overall conditions, and then some more specific conditions in which truth and politics fall out of alignment or accord in modern democracy. So one condition has to do with populist hostility to current expertise and the knowledge system. I'm calling that expertise in the knowledge system, EKR, expertise knowledge regime, right? And so one circumstance would be in which there is popular suspicion that the elite knowledge people are systematically biased in favor of certain and against other views, right? And that the views that they're biased against are popular views of ordinary people. That would be a excuse me, sorry, a circumstance in which that tends to then make it likely that there's going to be populist pushback. So you can think here, for instance, about the controversy about teaching Darwinian evolutionary theory in the public schools in the United States, and the idea that, well, that may be just fine with certain liberal Protestants, but it doesn't go down so well with some evangelicals. And so the knowledge system doesn't just equally correct everyone's ignorance, it specifically targets certain groups as backwards, and they resent and push back against that. A second circumstance here is one in which the expertise and knowledge system of the society is widely viewed as corrupted by wealth and power, right? And so, for instance, if you believe that trickle-down economics or some kind of supply side economic theory, or more broadly neoliberal theory, is the reigning view in economics for a long time, not because the evidence clearly favors that view. But because, and then you could say, well, economists tend to be quite wealthy. And this is a view that tends to minimize the taxes of economists and wealthy people, right? Or alternatively, that these views got their hold through the work of various think tanks and institutes that were funded by very wealthy people. And hence, this research got greater support and credibility because of the interests it served, not because of its intrinsic epistemic advantages, right? And so that would be a second circumstance in which you say, I just don't trust the whole business. I think they're doing it not for good reasons, but because it serves the interests of the people propagating this knowledge or their sponsors. A third condition, the suspicion that access to the elite knowledge regime is unfairly monopolized by the already privileged, or that educational or intellectual qualifications serve those who have them as markers of privilege that further unfairly advantage them. Right. And so I've talked with you about this in the past. It's been a while. There's some really stunning research done on the amount that the average family that gains access to a selective college or university spends on getting their child prepared to compete for that higher education, right? And the figure is roughly $200,000 per child from birth to age 18. So it doesn't include college tuition. By the way, it doesn't include private school tuition either. It does include the differential tax you pay to live in an area with good schools. And then it includes all kinds of what are called concerted cultivation or enrichment expenses. But putting all that to one side, let's focus on the number, $200,000 per child to gain access to selective higher education. Obviously, the majority of Americans are not in a position to spend that much per child, right? And so the sense that in some way it's merit, it's desert that explains why this kid got to go to Sarah Lawrence or Yale or Berkeley and this kid didn't, that doesn't hold up very well with what people know, experience, understand. That nobody who went to my school competes to go to any of those schools, right? It's not the case that the smartest kid gets to go there, and then they begin to become suspicious of the entire enterprise. Similarly, if you live in a moment like the moment we live in which the main determinant, the best predictor or correlate of whether or not you are going to be economically secure is whether you have completed a college education, you begin to suspect this is not then genuine uh, knowledge credentialing. This is just a status marker. It's a way of keeping people like me from competing with people like them. And this is deeply unfair. I resent it. I'm certainly not going to respect it. And so in these circumstances, Sophia Rosenfeld and others suggest that it may be that greater value will be placed on, quote, authenticity than on truth or expertise, where authenticity is telling it the way you see it or presenting yourself in a sincere way, especially if you suspect that knowledge is really covering over for some other interest or functioning in some other way in your society. You may prefer authenticity to truth. And I think this is a really good way to view the outcome of the 2016 election, that clearly Hillary Clinton knew more, was better qualified in terms of the traditional metrics of experience and her mastery of policy discourse. But Donald Trump seemed more authentic, and people were more inclined to trust his straightforward self presentation to her seemingly pedantic, condescending mastery of the knowledge relevant to government. So right, that's one set of concerns. Again, not something where this happens only once, but where there's been a pattern of this recurring and then being addressed and then recurring again. A second set of issues have to do with the degree of intrinsic tension between common sense and expert knowledge. Is what ordinary people think generally aligned with what experts think? Or are experts really trying to force ordinary people to fundamentally change their minds, to stretch or to learn things that they don't currently understand? And so the clearest question here is simply one of content. Is what you believe aligned with what experts tell you or not? I'll come back to the example of climate change. I think at this moment, this in fact has started to change, because as we see more and more extreme weather, more frequent and powerful hurricanes, monsoons, floods, droughts, fires, heat waves, we begin to accept as a matter of common sense what science has been telling us for 40 or 50 years. But 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, it was easier to disbelieve the scientific consensus about climate change, or to believe instead the merchants of doubt who were sponsored to muddy the waters for the rest of us, um, in part because it just didn't feel like there was a major change occurring in the weather, in the temperature of the planet. We couldn't see the carbon dioxide accumulating. And so, right, the question of how much divergence or convergence there is really important in terms of the substance. A second issue, and I think this is again closely related, is the extent of available knowledge. And in particular, and here I'll just give a variety of qualifications. How complex, how differentiated, how specialized, how esoteric is the expert knowledge? And so even if it doesn't completely diverge from common sense, if it's just kind of head spinningly complex and you end up feeling, as they say, cognitively overburdened, you might end up saying, this doesn't make any sense. This is way too complicated. How can the world be so complex? And rejecting, right, as unattainable, inaccessible expert knowledge. And then turning to the third factor, and here now we're getting to the way in which what experts tell us affect our interests, and the degree to which the truth or the current expert consensus is either inconvenient, and their climate change is the clear example. Wait, you're telling me I have to drive a smaller car or a hybrid? I have to live in a smaller home. I have to change my heating system. I have to change my consumption patterns for something I can't see at all, that there's no evidence in my world that this is real. So that's right, as Al Gore called it, an inconvenient truth. We have to change our economy, our consumption patterns, because experts tell us, not because we see the evidence around us. And then there are also what I would call disagreeable truths. And these are truths that are not just, right, adversely affecting our interests, but actually, in a sense, attacking our self-conceptions. And so the idea that the United States is founded on systematic racial injustice, and that this is not a fact of the past, but in fact has been subject to successive reiteration across generations into the present, that we still have something akin to a racial caste system operating in our society, and that much of what we think of as middle class wealth in the United States was generated or facilitated by government policy in the middle of the 20th century, and that policy was targeted for Americans of European descent and mainly excluded African Americans, all of that means that probably most white Americans do not fully deserve the wealth they have, in the sense that they did not earn it in a fair competition with all other Americans, that in fact their wealth relied on spending tax dollars in racist ways, in relied on the exploitation of racial minorities, the subordination of African Americans. And again, that's kind of an attack on your self-understanding when experts are trying to get you to accept that, and you're perhaps already in a fragile or defensive place. It's really hard to accept it. Now, let me turn to some more historically specific or contingent sources that emerge out of Sophia Rosenfeld's work. I've got 5 of them. The degree to which the inability to understand and master expert knowledge is experienced as disempowering or undermining personal and political agency. And so we're coming up on Hanukkah here. I'll use a cooking example, right? Let's say you've spent a long time working on your potato latkes and you feel like you've got a really great recipe and technique, and you make a beautiful batch, and everybody who comes over compliments you on how golden and light and fluffy they are, and you feel really good about it, right? You have some mastery, some control over your situation because you've acquired over time some knowledge about how to do this, right? And being told what you know is not sufficient to act on, that you have to learn something new, that can be challenging. And especially if you're already in a position where you don't feel much power, where you don't feel much agency. And I'll just point out that the vast majority of Americans work for relatively large corporations where they have very little autonomy in their workplace. That the vast majority of Americans, for good reasons, don't feel that their votes or their citizenship translates into much capacity to influence their society. The vast majority of us feel like our technology is a runaway train taking us wherever it wants to, irrespective of its consequences for us. And so, in various ways, the experience of disempowerment, of lack of agency, is part of the 21st century social fabric. And then you add to that, oh, and by the way, you don't know enough to be able to vote responsibly on this issue until you've been instructed by those who are more expert and better educated than you. That can definitely produce resentment, pushback, disagreement. The availability of simplifying alternative narratives, conspiracy theories, right? And the idea that government is unresponsive to your interests, your needs, that people like you seem not ever to be able to make a dent in the way in which policies are made, could easily be explained by suggesting there's some terrible evil cabal out there doing this to you, right? And that makes it a lot easier to understand. And it turns out that cognitively, we're much more inclined to believe explanations that personify whatever it is we're dealing with, that say there's the person, it's their fault, as opposed to some big structural force that doesn't have a name, a face, an identity. And so when there are narratives that simplify and appeal, and they circulate broadly, they attain a lot of adherence, that makes it more likely that people are going to prefer the simplified narrative over the expert knowledge. Third, and now we're finally getting to the disruption of the media sphere or the media system, and with it the knowledge system and the public sphere. by new technology. And we are in the midst of one of the most important intellectual technology and communication revolutions in human history. I really do believe that we are witnessing something akin to the revolution that occurred with the printing press, and it's occurring in a very accelerated fashion. And there's a general point here, which is that when new technology is introduced, especially when it is introduced quickly, it opens the floodgates for the spread of disinformation and unfiltered demagoguery. This is in part because we don't have the norms, the regulations, the institutions, the media literacy to understand the way in which the new technology is changing discourse, spreading information in new forms, and to begin to develop the standards via which to differentiate the reliable from the unreliable. And so not surprisingly, in these kinds of conditions, we get demagogues. We get populist movements when radio begins to become ubiquitous. We get Hitler, we get Mussolini. When the newspaper begins to become ubiquitous, we get populism, yellow journalism, know nothingism, and nationalism breaking out in so many of these countries. And we are obviously in the middle of one of these revolutions in communication technology. Fourth factor, and here I'm now going to focus on something that is deeper and more cultural and has to do with the political culture of a democracy, in particular, the ethics of citizenship and whether or not you are inclined to trust your fellow citizens, to listen to them. And I want to suggest that when democracy does best, there's a widespread understanding that citizenship carries with it certain rights, but also certain duties, including duties of civility, which mean you have to listen to the other side. You have to hear out their argument and you have to respond to it. And that in addition to that, part of being a good citizen is taking the positions, supporting the candidates and the policies that are supported by the best evidence and the best arguments. You don't just want to win. As a matter of fact, you don't want to win if your side has the worst argument. You want your side to figure out its mistake and figure out how to re-articulate its values in accord with the factual information that turns out to be valid. Alternatively, in periods of radical partisanship, we care more about our side winning than we do about whether our side is right. We tend not to hear the other side. They're so awful, they're so evil that there's nothing we can learn from them, that we don't owe them a hearing, that we don't have a duty of civility to respond to their remarks. Sophia Rosenfeld has, I think, a really nice phrase for this. She calls it tribal epistemology. Our side is right, the other side is wrong. That's all we need to know. And that vouchsafes our knowledge. It seals it from criticism, from the need to participate in discourse to test its validity. And in those moments, we're much more inclined to be disrespectful of authority and knowledge and information. Finally, and this is really, I think, specific to the late 20th and the early 21st century, the idea that we live in a moment of greater cultural pluralism, that we've got used to, and at least many of us have, greater racial diversity, greater ethnic diversity, greater religious diversity and diversity of worldviews, and that this leads us to embrace at least we hope, greater tolerance for the most part, right? That it's no longer the case that I can assume that everybody shares my religion, my worldview, my cultural background, and I have to acknowledge when it is that my worldview is just my worldview. So um, in at Sarah Lawrence the other day, I was teaching Hannah Arendt's essay on truth in politics, and one of my students started her contribution to the seminar by saying, "Well, my truth is," and I actually interrupted her at that point, and I said, "I'm sorry, but Hannah Arendt is spinning in her grave right now. You don't get your truth, right? You have your opinion, your idea, your belief, you're entitled to that. But the truth is not indexed to your experience. The truth is objective and verifiable, right? But I think what my student was saying is very much indicative of what many people believe today, which is that if there's all this pluralism, shouldn't truth also be relative to the group that it belongs to? And I think Donald Trump has been very adept at, in a sense, turning multiculturalism on its head and saying, well, if the African Americans have their culture, we white European Americans have our culture, and I'm going to represent it. So I hope this is making sense. I wanted to introduce all of this. I'm now going to spend a minute or two on Trump and bringing it back to him, and then a few minutes on digital technology. And so I want to be right to elucidate the idea that Donald Trump has a post-truth political stance, and to look at the elements of it. On the one hand, right, he starts by dismissing the forms of knowledge generation and propagation that are most credible in our society. He tells you that's fake news. Don't believe it, right? And so that's a characteristic move of a demagogue, of a populist, trying to discredit their opponents, not on the basis of the strength of their arguments or the verifiability of their claims, but simply because of what they represent or what their identity is. And then to take it back to Sophia Rosenfeld's framework, right? That occurs much more readily in certain contexts where there's suspicion that the current expertise and knowledge system is biased or favors some or functions as a mode of privilege, or when the tension between common sense and expert knowledge is high, where expert knowledge seems inaccessible, it's easy to say, well, don't worry, all that stuff is rubbish, right? And then providing a personal charismatic alternative. When you hear Trump speak, one of the things you will notice, a constant refrain, believe me, believe me, believe me, right? That he has insight, he has, right, other sources of information. He says, people are saying, I've been told, if you knew what I knew, right? And some sense that we can cut through all of those biased experts if we follow this individual. Relying on gut instinct or hunches, right? And the sense, and all of us have it, intuition, right? And we know much more from cognitive science about how this works, how our minds generate understandings of the world without us having to engage in any sort of reflective, self-conscious, deliberative activity. That's gut, that's hunch, that's instinct. It actually comes from the mind. But having said that, to rely exclusively on it is almost always a mistake. And certainly for the president of the United States to rely on his gut, we've got all of these reports as the biographies and histories are coming out of Donald Trump, right? You know, not having interest for the briefings that he's getting, like the daily intelligence briefings before he's going to meet with Putin or negotiate with the North Koreans. He doesn't want that information. He wants to be able to rely exclusively on his ideas that are just popping into his brain. Fourth aspect of this, prioritizing will over understanding. And so the example I'll go with here, and it works also for the idea that power and authority, not knowledge and verifiability, make truth. These are closely related ideas. On the first day of Donald Trump's presidency, maybe it's the second day, right? Donald Trump has his press secretary assert that his inauguration is the largest inauguration in history, by far larger than Barack Obama's, when the photographic evidence and the Park Service are absolutely clear. No, it's a small portion of the people who attended Obama's inauguration who are there for Trump's inauguration. But what Trump is basically saying is, I'm not going to try to count the people. I'm going to tell you, and what I tell you is going to go, right? So his will, his power, his authority makes the truth. And I think for a certain number of people, the idea in particular that a older white man gets to tell everybody else what is true and impose his will on reality is appealing. Finally, we can remember that Donald Trump, if he's a genius of anything, it's branding and marketing. And he's been tremendously successful at it. And that marketing is truth indifferent, right? What sells is what sells, not what is necessarily true. And that Trump comes out of that world and, in a sense, approached politics as if it was just an extension of his experience in that world. Now, I want to say one more thing about Trump at this juncture, and that is that he's about to enter a world that is mainly unresponsive to his post-truth stance and approach to politics. His business was just convicted of 17 counts of felony. Now, the fine is not going to make a difference to Donald Trump, but reputationally, it is going to, it seems to me, take some of the gloss off of the idea that he's this tremendously successful businessman. Much more importantly, there are multiple ongoing criminal investigations, and I have no inside information, but it seems to me that it's rather unlikely that Donald Trump is going to escape without a single indictment based on all of the separate avenues that he is being investigated for, both by the Department of Justice, but also in Georgia, also in New York. And this then means that he will have to defend himself in a court of law, and a court of law has very clear evidentiary standards, and that will prevent him from relying on any of this and demand that he defend himself via verifiable information, knowledge, claims, things that are actually true. And so Donald Trump may be about to be in for a cold bath in this regard, but to be as clear as possible, remember, right, that everything on this list, all of the indicators or predictors of a populist anti-truth moment or era in our politics will continue to hold even after Donald Trump is no longer on the political scene in the United States. So that's, I think, where I should wrap up for today. I wanted to say more to you about what the digital media revolution is doing to our public sphere, but I am out of time and I do want to leave room for discussion as well. So we can come back to this next week or on a different occasion. Who wants to start us out? And you'll give me just a second, go ahead and speak. I have to plug in my computer or it's going to die. Who wants to start us out? Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, Flossie. Go ahead, Flossie.
Okay, just a simple. Do I have the floor? Yes.
It's just echoing, Flossie. Sorry. Barbara, can you mute for a second? I'll come to you next. Okay? Perfect. Okay, go ahead, Flossie.
There's no question that Trump is in a lot of trouble, but who is going to arrest him? Is the FBI going to come in with handcuffs and guns? How do we actually arrest this genius, this evil genius? What I am expressing, I guess, is my own foolish conspiracy theory that there are a lot of people in the FBI who have been or who will refuse to arrest this man.
Wow. Okay. So
I can't imagine that magic moment happening.
So let me.
Allies floating around who should be in prison.
So let me start by noting that in a lot of the recent setbacks that Donald Trump has experienced in court, and note he had a little victory yesterday, in addition to some considerable setbacks. The judges ruling against him have been judges he appointed, right? And admittedly, the culture of the law is different from the culture of law enforcement, the judicial culture, right? And so there's perhaps greater adherence to the clear black letter of the law, as they say there. But I don't know that it's the case that Donald Trump has that much loyalty from ordinary law enforcement officers. They may support him, but they may also want to keep their jobs. And it may actually be part of their identity that they enforce the law as needs be, even when they disagree with it. But having said that, let me be as clear as possible. I suspect the scenario here is that if Donald Trump is to be arraigned, they will tell his lawyers, we want you to come to the court at this particular day and time for that to occur, and he'll show up, right? I mean, and the reason he'll show up is because his exposure is so high, right? You know, if he doesn't show up, it has consequences for his business, fines, etc. And then in addition to that, I suspect that we've got somebody's screen save on. I'm not quite sure how to get that off. Bonita, we're viewing your screen for some reason. There we go. And that's not the worry. I mean, I think the worry is much more. And by the way, I think Donald Trump will see this maybe as an opportunity as well, an opportunity to use his day in court to play his brand of grievance politics. And so he may even welcome it as a path to resurrection in American politics. And so we may be in a very different scenario. And by the way, that probably worries me much more than the logistics of how Donald Trump will be arrested should he be actually indicted. Does it make sense, Flossie?
Yes, thank you.
Barbara, go ahead.
It's actually David on Barbara's iPad.
I should have seen that if I was looking. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about this tension between the sort of the evidentiary tradition and that kind of authoritative disposition in asserting truth and explanation. First of all, the notion of common sense is inherently cultural. There's a famous book by an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz from the 70s and early 80s called Common Sense, and it's all about how it varies dramatically by culture. And it's sort of approaches your, what was your term, tribal something, tribal
epistemology.
Tribal epistemologies, yeah, it's sort of like that. Secondly, there's one of the reasons I think it's so hard for people to figure out how to handle the EKR tradition is that we, in academia in particular, we breed a notion of provisionality and almost relativism in our notion of, if not truth, at least the most plausible explanation of things. As a matter of fact, the principle of uncertainty is inherent in all kinds of evident, how we use statistics to evaluate the plausibility of evidence. And this also shows up in history, where people talk about the assumptions that historians make and how that shapes the particular interpretations they bring forward. So what counts in history, and to a certain extent, literary interpretation, is the quality of the argument you make, not the particular position that you happen to take on what's, quote, true about the world. So truth doesn't, truth as an independent entity doesn't matter so much in those things. And then finally, I'd like to say that as near as I can tell, the general attitude toward evidence and research and things like that is that it's fine as long as it is consistent with my version of common sense. But the minute that that science begins to challenge my version of common sense, that's the science that I'm going to choose not to pay attention to. So people are happy to incorporate science when it matches their version of common sense, however they came by it. And I find this, my field was educational research, and I find this all the time in educational research. As long as your evidence corroborates my bias, I'm happy to accept it. So I think it's really hard for people to grow up in this sort of this academic tradition of skepticism and uncertainty, and then figure out how to manage the challenges between the authoritative sort of and cultural common sense version of truth and the scientific one. That's all.
That's all. Just a little bit. Thank you. You are pulling us into some deep waters, and I'm going to say just a few things. And who knows? You and I, next time I'm in California, maybe we need to have coffee and go into it in greater depth. But having said that, the first point you make about Gertz and about the cultural specificity of different forms of common sense, I completely accept that point. And one of the things that Rosenfeld, and she's working broadly speaking in the tradition of Michel Foucault, the great French philosopher who said knowledge and power are inseparable, right? We have different knowledge regimes at different periods of history. But having said all that, I don't want to say that the knowledge culture completely dictates what truth is, right? So different societies have different knowledge cultures. Absolutely true. Does that mean that there's no capital T truth, right? That gets us into, I think, an entirely different, rather metaphysical question. I don't think noting the way in which different cultures facilitate different ways of knowing means that necessarily all knowledge is culturally mediated. So that's the first point. Second point, I'm going to throw out the word fallibilism, right? For kind of the academic stance, which is, no, and another word here would be humility, right? That what I say is my current best view on this subject. And I think it's right, and I'm happy to defend it as best I can. But having said all of that, I also have to acknowledge that this is an ongoing enterprise, and I'm just at one moment in this enterprise, right? And so I do think actually that's a really important part of citizens' ethics as well, is acknowledging
is
that
acknowledged.
you don't, and nobody does
You don't, and
monopolize.
nobody does monopolize.
And David, I'm gonna mute you, and you can unmute yourself if you want to come back. Your third point, and I might again put it a little bit differently from you, but yes, we all have our interpretive perspectives. They influence what we know and what we think we know and how we construct our knowledge. And there's a famous 20th century philosopher, Quine, who used the metaphor of a web. And so, right, if you get an inconvenient result someplace, you can adjust other things in the web so you can maintain your central beliefs while somehow accommodating the dissident beliefs. There's a lot of room for that, but eventually sometimes paradigm changes do occur, and they occur because of the greater explanatory power of the alternative paradigm. So yes, when in the short term, expertise that challenges common sense may be dismissed or rationalized or accommodated without giving up your central ideas. But eventually, if your central ideas are consistently discredited by a more powerful alternative, it may be hard to resist. That doesn't help us very much in the decade to come. It might help us 50 years from now if we make it. John, go ahead. You're still muted, John.
I'm sorry, on a more
That's okay.
mundane level, but returning to an earlier theme, Peggy Noonan's headline this morning is "Only the Voters Can Crush Donald Trump." And her argument is being made to all the Republican leaders around the country in the Republican Party who are themselves totally fed up with Trump. But as to what to do about it, the first thing is grassroots action that will actually get to voters and talk to them respectively and get them to change their mind. The second thing is somehow ought to make sure that we don't have 15 Republican candidates for president running in every primary. Trump got no more than 30% of the vote in about 8 primaries until he never got over 50% until Vermont, very late in the game. And if only 2 or 3 people instead of 12 were running, the chances of him losing that primary are probably very high.
Yeah. And in particular, if the scenario is that you have someone like Ron DeSantis running against Trump, who is fighting for the Trump base with Trump, and then somebody who's very different from Trump, a non-MAGA Republican. And the fact that DeSantis and Trump are dividing that portion of the Republican base makes it plausible that the third person would then have a path. Having said that, it's one thing to say, okay, get out of the way of, and then you fill in the blank. Who is that third person, right? It's another thing for all those dozen Republicans who think they might have a shot at being the next president of the United States to say, okay, I'll wait so that it's your turn, right? And I completely agree with you. Only the voters can, or with Peggy Noonan, Trump still has a substantial loyal base among core Republican voters, and that is the basic logic of electoral democracy. When you've got that, that's why I say he's down but he's not out. He has a path back. I think one of the questions is he going to lose his luster with those voters over the next 2 years? And unless things start moving in a different direction for him, right? Part of Trump's claim in 2016 is he's this remarkably successful businessman. Part of his claim is if you elect him, he will win so often you'll get tired of winning, right? That doesn't appear very credible in 2022. And frankly, in 2016, where Trump barely won the Electoral College, right? And 80,000 votes in a handful of states going differently, and Hillary Clinton would have been president. The Electoral College and the popular vote would have aligned as opposed to going in different directions. Maybe that was a peculiar anomaly that year. And what we're seeing since then, 2018, 2020, 2022, is that Donald Trump is much better at claiming to be an electoral magician than actually at working electoral magic. And so maybe the voters are already turning away from Trump. I don't know. That's the thing about elections, is you actually have to conduct them to figure out how they're going to go, right? And we'll see in 2 years. 2 years from now, as I never tire of saying, Donald Trump may be in jail as opposed to on the campaign trail. All right, everybody. Good being with you. I do have some more information on this, the stuff specifically about the networked public sphere and what it's doing to truth sensitivity in politics. Maybe we'll do a little bit of that next week, or maybe we'll save that for another occasion. In any event, take care. Happy holidays. I'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.